The year is 1348. You're sat amongst the bustle of a tavern in the port town of Weymouth, South England. Discussion of a new threat murmurs throughout the patrons' conversations. Not one of men marching on your town, no, an unseen killer. One that would come to be known as the Black Death. How on earth could something so devastating ever possibly make life better? Well, before it did, it made things an awful lot worse. The Black Death swept through Europe to Britain in the 14th century. Presumed to have originated from Asia, it passed through the trade routes of Europe and eventually to the British Isles. It was rampant. Primarily spread through infected fleas, the bubonic plague ravaged the population of wherever it found victims. Trade routes were hotbeds for travel. Once it had arrived in a village or town, it spread through families and homes at an unstoppable rate. As was common practice, the possessions of the dead were often passed on to relatives. This created a perfect method of transmission. Flea-housing garments were passed from father to son, mother to daughter, and sibling to sibling. Families were wiped out entirely. Within 2 years of its arrival on British shores, it killed up to 50% of the population. Bubonic, the most common variant of the plague, caused large boils to swell with pus on the lymph nodes of its victims, an agonising and unimaginable discomfort that must have occurred for the poor soul who fell ill, and one with little hope. It killed at a 60 to 90% success rate. The only silver lining, if you can call it that, is that you are most likely dead within the week. The panic and confusion must have been palpable. Nowadays it's understandable how an illness like this might be transferred from one to another, but in the 14th century they didn't have the same luxury. Doctors tried practices of bloodletting and boil lancing, or the burning of herbs and spices to rid the space of plague. Of course, none of these worked. You'll most likely have seen the beaked plague doctor mask. It's believed this actually only made an appearance in the 17th century when the plague reappeared, but even so, this preventative piece of headwear epitomised their understanding of the situation, and this was 300 years after the first wave that we're talking about today. They stuffed the beak with herbs and other components, as sweet perfumed air was believed to purify the plague-stricken areas and protect the doctor inside. Back to the 14th century. As mentioned, tactics were deployed to try and stop the spread, but with no understanding of what they were fighting, it was an uphill battle. Many believed it was a punishment from God, and so began to search for forgiveness for any sin they may have committed. Forms of social distancing and quarantine were introduced, which were perhaps the only successful methods attempted, with some ports quarantining entire crews of ships before making sure the plague wasn't visibly present, only them letting them integrate into society. Ultimately, despite attempts to slow the spread down, it turned out to be one of the worst pandemics we've ever seen. The Black Death started to ease up around 1350, most likely through a combination of quarantining and herd immunity. It came back in waves hundreds of years later, but for now, it had done its damage and seemingly ended, but the world wasn't the same place as it was before. To contextualise what happened after the Black Death had taken its toll, and how there might ever be any positives to take from its destruction, it's important to understand the social structure of 14th century Britain, and much of Europe for that matter. Britain operated under the feudal system, which is essentially a hierarchical structure that had royalty at the top and peasants at the bottom. The king owned all the land, but he couldn't look after all of it himself, it was far too vast. So he split the land up and gave it to those he trusted, the lords and nobility. They would pay the king a sum of money on a regular basis, and also promised to raise troops from their lands if the king were to ever need an army. These nobles were of course not going to work the land themselves, and therefore they enlisted peasants to work it. The peasants would live on the land and pay tax to the noble, whilst also working it. This system took hold of much of Europe from the 9th to the 15th century, and made for pretty tough living for those at the bottom of it. So what happens when you take those that the system is built on top of, the peasants, and cut their population in half? This is a case of supply and demand. Before the Black Death, the peasant population was large and growing. There were more than enough peasants to work the land owned by the lords. This meant that wages could be set by the lords, and the peasantry didn't have much of a say as to whether or not they'd work it, because if one family said no, another family would be sure to say yes. This gave the lords control. So as the Black Death started to ease up in 1350, the same system struggles as there's now only half the population. There simply weren't enough people to work the same amount of land. And this is where, if you were one of the lucky peasants to survive the plague, things might be looking up. This account of the Black Death in the Cathedral Priory Chronicle at Rochester was written no later than 1350, and it paints a picture as to what was being experienced at the time. The mortality destroyed more than a third of the men, women and children. Such a shortage of workers ensued that the humble turned up their noses at employment, and could scarcely be persuaded to serve the eminent unless for triple wages. As a result, churchmen, knights and other worthies have been forced to thresh their corn, plough the land, and perform every other unskilled task if they're to make their own bread. So what this quote is saying in simple terms is, more than a third of the population were dead, and so workers only agreed to work the land they previously did for triple the wages. Such a drastic increase in wages led the higher classes in society to work the land themselves, although it's debated whether any actually did. What's described here is a level of social mobility not seen until after the devastation of the Black Death had enabled it. Workers were able to say no. Ultimately, this saw an increase in wages in some cases, and a slight closing of the gap between the elites and the peasantry. But this isn't to say the upper classes weren't going to roll over without a fight. In 1349, the Ordinance of Labourers Law was introduced. This was specifically created due to the loss of life and subsequent social and economical impact of the Black Death. The law tried to tackle the issue of rising wages, which in turn caused a level of inflation. To do so, the law stated, employers may not pay and workers may not receive wages higher than pre-plague levels. Everyone under 60 must work. Employers must not hire excess workers, and food must be priced reasonably with no excess profit. It also stated to not give to able-bodied beggars, as to force anyone trying to survive by these means into the workforce. This was an attempt to control the wages in the country, and a call to work for the nation's population, stating that anyone able-bodied under the age of 60 must work. This was further backed up by another law, the Statute of Labourers in 1351, that similarly outlawed the ability to ask for or seek higher wages than pre-plague levels. It seems that both laws were poorly enforced, and the wages did indeed rise after the Black Death, closing the gap between the wealthy landowners and the peasantry. If not marking the beginning of the process of ending feudalism and serfdom, at least accelerating the process towards its collapse. Although not the single cause, the social and economic tensions created by the Black Death also contributed to the Peasants' Revolt, which occurred 30 years later. The Peasants' Revolt was an uprising of the peasant class due to a number of issues occurring at the time. Some caused by the plague, some by war with France in the 100 Years' War, primarily high taxation to pay for the war. The legacy of the revolt is debated to this day, with some historians saying it marked the end of serfdom, and some thinking that might be somewhat of an overstatement. What's clear to see is that its demands of less harsh laws, money for the poor, freedom and equality all find themselves as part of modern day democracy. However its impact may be debated, the state of post-plague Britain had contributed to what has become a monumentally important moment in British history. So yes, after the devastation and massive loss of life, there were some silver linings to come from the Black Death. Higher wages and bargaining power led to a shift in social mobility for the peasant class, and had a knock-on effect for causing some further changes down the line. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.